A capacity crowd congregated at the Gordon Institute of Business Science for a forum event on digital transformation, which was broadcast live on CNBC Africa. Join us for this highlight special from the event. Digital transformation is no longer a thought in the distant future, it is now. We live in the digital age and companies are aligning their strategies to the digital reality. The audience heard how a big 135-year-old conglomerate like GE repositioned itself as a digital industrial company, and how Africa fits into this global picture from freight logistics company Transnet.
The Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of CNBC Africa, Bronwyn Nielsen, sits down with the Global Chairman and CEO of GE, Jeff Immelt, as well as the Group CEO of Transnet, Siyabonga Gama, and really begins to go in-depth in terms of what can be unlocked from digital transformation, and in particular, the exciting news of the first digital partnership that these two giants have come together to co-create. Over to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks very much, Nazipo. Well, let's drill down into the numbers. I love numbers. You're talking about a $100 billion market being the industrial internet. Over what time frame?
So again, I think the context is by 2025. That it's on a kind of the same kind of S-curve of adoption that has taken place in many of the other elements of the internet. We've seen, just to give a frame of reference. She was at the what we call Minds and Machines, which is an annual event. The first one we had in 2012, we had maybe 300 people in San Francisco. Last year we had about 3,000 people. So you start seeing industrial adoption happen at a very rapid pace.
Siya, we've just come off the Davos stage at the World Economic Forum annual meeting 2017, and Intra-African Trade was a big debate point. In fact, we debated this extensively with President Kagame, who feels that Intra-African Trade sits at around 17%. I'm closer to those numbers of around 15%. Jeff, in your presentation, and in Siya, your presentation, you both mentioned what this will do in terms of kicking up intra-Africa trade. Perhaps you can elaborate slightly on that front, Siya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bronwyn, and good evening to all the listeners. It's actually quite an important aspect, because as we talk about the fact that the world is going slightly anti-globalization, regional integration becomes quite an important aspect in terms of how we can unlock opportunities as we drive an open economy. And what we've seen on the continent is a lot of missing links in terms of infrastructure, which make it difficult in terms of doing trade with one another. But also you have long queues at borders. Where because we still have lots of paper in terms of customs clearances that we have to do. And when you begin to look at what kind of efficiencies in terms of continuous improvement, this kind of partnership that we're looking at is one that begins to say, how can you do more with less? How can you utilize exactly the same assets that you have to do more and to pump more output? So from an intra-Africa trajectory for us, we believe that even if we can just move from the 15 to 17% that you talk about to about 30%, it's going to unlock so much value in terms of the number of jobs that can be created in Africa. It's going to unlock so much value in terms of the commoditization that will take place in terms of being able to move minerals from producers to where the markets are. And there's a lot that we can do just as a continent on our own, while the rest of the world decides what it wants to do with globalization.
So, I've spent this week in Nigeria, Angola, now South Africa. There's no way to diversify the economies of Africa without more rail transportation, better logistics, better infrastructure. It's really one of the missing pieces. And to Siya's point, if you go from 17 to 30%, you're not going to be able to afford going to 30% more assets. So we've got to get more out of the assets that are in the ground. And that's the way to think about what this technology can do. You
mentioned Nigeria. It's a big debate point as far as the African continent is concerned, having now formally moved into a technical recession, and we know the situation is relatively dire. considering the foreign exchange issues they're also dealing with. What was your sense of Nigeria on the ground? Are you more optimistic than negative?
Look, I always start kind of with the big picture. So the big picture in Nigeria is like they need 40 gigawatts of electricity. They have all the natural gas they need to fuel all of the power that they need. And my name's General Electric. You know, that's an opportunity. Okay. Now, when you go down, I think it's time for action. You know, if I just go down to power, they need to get a gigawatt of power online by the end of this year. Everybody has to drop everything they're doing, including the government, and stay on this task until it happens. And so they can count on us to be there with them as they do it. But I think it's one of those things in Nigeria where they can solve some of their own problems. You can actually do this even without, you know, external financing, because the savings kind of pay for the project itself. But it's time for action. That's really what you see when you go there.
And that resonated, time for action, over and over at the World Economic Forum, I think not only on the Africa stage, but on the global stage. So let's talk about the low-hanging fruit. Let's talk about this relationship. Where are you going to get started? Because you know, as CNBC Africa, we're going to be there to measure and monitor the progress, specifically as we move into the World Economic Forum Africa, which is the 3rd to the 5th of May in Durban. So Siya, the low-hanging fruit, where does this project actually kick off?
You'd probably know that late last year, GE opened its innovation center just across the road from here. And they've been working with us, and we've located some young minds at the CSIR, and we're working together in terms of looking at developing software, developing the apps, and beginning to say how can we liberate the logistics chain. Using the state-of-the-art technologies. GE has got a Predix platform that they use globally, which they try to leverage quite a lot of things on. It does far more than just what we are talking about. It looks at how you could optimize trains. It looks at how you could save costs. So we are working together to say, let us develop an African solution. Let us leverage the knowledge that we have of this continent.
I have to come in. Africa solution, shouldn't we start talking about regional solutions first? What about we take the low-hanging fruit in East Africa, considering the East African community is working so well together? Would that not be a little more realistic? Or are we going for the big dream here? This is an Africa-wide solution.
We never stop to dream, and really our dreams nowadays, they become a reality. We're not dreaming for the sake of dreaming, because a lot of people say if you dream for the sake of dreaming, that's a vision. But what we're doing is to actualize. We are looking very close to where we are. Where we operate at the moment, we've got 7 railways contiguous to our railway, and in fact, our locomotives, they go into those countries. And that is where the low-hanging fruit is. We would like to then also connect with what is happening in the Great Lakes region, because there's quite a lot that is happening in the East African community, which is great. And then if you bring in that Rwandan sort of corridor as well, but you can do a lot of east-west, you can also do a lot of north-south. And we think we can do that at the shortest possible time, because I think in terms of low-hanging fruit, people are saying, in terms of the gaps, how fast can we close those gaps, and when will we start trading? You'll see that with SACU, with ECOWAS, with COMESA, with the preferential trade areas, we are beginning to say we're building a very big trading block here, and let's start to move in earnest.
When we talk about digitization, we've got to take the starting point as energy, as power. The stat you know well, half the African continent does not have access to power. This is obviously part of your solution, but it's going to be a challenge in digitizing Africa's transport sector.
Well, I would make 2 comments. First, I think back to your question for Siya, for everybody that's watching tonight, for everybody in the room here tonight, there's one application that's right in front of you, right? That's actually not that hard to do. I would say for most railroads around the world, it's fuel savings. So to try to get a way to optimize the way that they run their locomotive, to get 5 or 10% fuel savings, that pays for itself very quickly. And then what Siya talks about is ways to use very inexpensive sensors to operate with trucks and locomotives to have visibility so that you can schedule better. Those don't sound that sophisticated, but that's worth billions of dollars of savings. Now, I think when it comes to power, look, I think one of the first things you need to do is take all of the brownfields, right? All of the existing assets that might be working at 25 or 30% efficiency, and if you can just get 5% more efficiency using controls and software, that's step one, right? So I think what I always tell people on this is start with the easy things first. You know, and the only way Nigeria or any country is going to solve its power issues is take the existing assets and make them work better. And the way to think about industrial internet or digital industrial is these are the tools that are going to take your existing assets and help them work better.
The skills element, which Siya touched on, and the innovation center, the GE Innovation Center that has opened here in Johannesburg. This is obviously going to be a key part of the partnership, and enormous skills transfer going to have to take place between GE and Transnet in this space, specifically in the STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, maths. There's going to be a driving force of the project, and how quickly are you going to be able to roll out depth and breadth of skills across the continent?
Look, STEM matters. It matters in a lot of different ways for South Africa and every country around the world. You know, I spent 2 years leading President Obama's Jobs Council. Really 4 things that we recommended to him: infrastructure, work on small business, regulatory reform, but skills training was, and that's true in every country around the world. So South Africa needs a software. They need a software community. They need a venture community. And we need to be able to attract people that are comfortable bridging between software and hard assets like locomotives. And this is going to define job creation, I think, in the future. So we need the skills development in a big way.
Could we say that South Africa, given the developed infrastructure in this space, is going to be the incubator of those skills? That's what you're alluding to here.
It's got a real chance. I mean, I think if the extent to which the market breaks down along regional lines from a use case basis, South Africa has real opportunity to lead the way.
Policy consistency, does that sound familiar? Again, another big debate point coming out of Davos, and in particular with regards to Africa.
I don't talk about politics anymore.
Siya can do it. Siya spends a lot of time negotiating with the presidents across the African continent. Siya, this was a point that was labored at the World Economic Forum, and I'm going to go back to the comment that was made by Phuthuma Nhleko, who's executive chairman of MTN, one of the biggest telecommunications company globally. And he invests $4 billion annually into the African continent. He was sitting next to the Vice President, Osinbajo, of Nigeria, when he said if there was policy consistency, he would be investing $8 billion on an annual basis. So I put that to you because here are the investors, but you do need policy consistency, especially in your space. Your projects are 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years.
Yeah. You're quite right. Policy consistency, policy stability, the right institutional framework for investments and the ability to be able to recoup investments, but also monetary policy stability so that you are able to also repatriate your profits and reinvest in other projects is quite critical. And I think what we see on the continent is a lessening of conflict. We are also seeing, peer pressure in terms of other presidents. When one president does not want to leave his post, they tell him to go. I think that's quite critical. But also, people are looking at continuity in terms of each and every country to say it doesn't matter if there's regime change. What is important is to be able to say there's seamless transfer of power between different parties, and that there's a continuation in terms of that policy stability. It's quite critical to unlock the kinds of investments that we're looking at, because as we start to look at skills transfer and to train people, we want to be able to recoup those investments. So it's quite important, and I think even financial institutions They don't want to be writing step-in rights in every contract that they do on the continent to say, you know, if this doesn't happen, who is going to take over this? Because you then need lots of guarantees and suretyship, which is really underperforming money that banks keep just in case a particular risk arises.
We were having a discussion earlier today about Africa's star waning, or Africa's moon waning, in relation to the global problems. And yet here you sit, Jeff, investing in the African continent, saying this is the place to make money effectively, and you're not scared of Africa. Give me a little bit more about why Africa is so attractive to you.
Came to Africa thinking that everything was going to be orderly growth in a straight line. Point them out to me, because I want to do a deal with them. You know, so I think we always prepare. You know, one of the advantages of size and diversity is that we can play through cycles in a better way. So I still look at Africa the same way I did before, and said everything we sell as a company is needed in an extraordinary way in the continent. So I think. You never make the best deals when times are good. You make the smartest deals when you're going through a cycle. So we look at this as an opportunity. Today the issue is really financing, you know, so I think that's like oxygen today. But look, we can find ways to bring money from around the world to do a project, even in a country that doesn't necessarily have the money, as long as there's a transparent scheme around how they, you know, how people get paid and things like that.
So this is de-risking Africa's infrastructure projects, or finding innovative financing models. Those are the terms being banned.
You know, again, I think people look, you know, smart people say over the long term, this is where there's going to be growth there. There's still an incredible amount of money around the world not being put to use, right? Where you can get a better return here. So the way to think about Africa is you're always going to take risk. You're going to take this much risk, and you have to find ways to get this much return, and you have to realize that they're both in balance. But look, I've spent the week here. We see a lot of projects that we can invest in, that we can move forward on, and you know, if there's fewer people that want to do it, more for us.
Let's pick up on what Jeff is talking about here, and that is really partnerships, depth and breadth of partnerships. It's private sector, it's public sector, other parties, NGOs coming to the organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, as we saw with President Adesina leading a charge into many of the spaces, Jeff, that you've mentioned. Siya, this for you is also an area that you are passionate about. That partnerships are what are needed to drive the growth across the African continent and close the infrastructure gaps. You know, the stat out there is that we will see GDP increasing by 30% in Africa by 2040 if you close that infrastructure gap.
No, I think partnerships are actually an important and enduring mentality that we need to create in terms of how we're going to move forward. And I think what I find is that Africans actually give Africa a bad name. Because
you know that you are speaking to 48 countries across the African continent right now.
It is Africans who give Africa a bad name because they don't posit all of the positive aspects in terms of what Africa can become and become. And challenge people to take the kinds of actions that ought to be taken. When they leave the continent and they go to other continents, they speak very ill about Africa. That's what the people outside of Africa tell me, some of the Africans. But if it takes people from outside to begin to see that there's opportunity, there's a vacuum that we as Africans are creating inside Africa. So we need to begin to say, how do we leverage some of the global skills, some of the global reach companies such as GE have, but also include local communities and local companies in terms of creating the kind of environment where business can thrive, where we can de-risk our projects, where we can also accelerate implementation. Because for us, I think the key thing as Africans is that there are opportunities. Let us actually go in there and let us get the good Africans who want to give Africa a good name, working towards making sure that we accelerate this project. So partnership, collaboration, getting the skills and the technology that others have. Africa has got the possibilities to leapfrog, because we don't have to reinvent what Europe and America already did. We can go in there, talk to them, use their IP to move forward much quicker.
I'm big into analogies. Sorry, Jeff, can I pull in here for a moment? And having just come out of Cote d'Ivoire with the African Development Bank and a talk shop in that space, I met a Nigerian entrepreneur who had started a business in the shea butter space and was doing beauty products in shea butter. It was easier for her, she's been trading for the last 10 years, to set up trade relations with Europe and with China than to explore that intra-Africa trade story, so South Africa or into East Africa. Now, what I'm hoping is that we're coming to a conclusion here where, gentlemen, you are saying to me that this project, this digitization of Africa's transport sector, is going to make it easier for that entrepreneur in Nigeria to unlock the opportunity to trade with South Africa, to trade with Kenya, rather than go further afield, and in so doing, insulate ourselves from global shocks. Is that what we're really aiming for here?
I mean, I think the one thing that's always been true with digitization in the consumer space or enterprise space is it does open up transparency, and it basically puts everybody on the same foundation on knowledge instantaneously, right? So it gives you the opportunity to really regionalize Africa or build better trade zones instantaneously. And so
it'll be less expensive.
Look, I think
and more
really,
efficient
even if you think about things like additive manufacturing and digitization, it's basically democratizes manufacturing. So we can have the same cost structure with a 500-person facility that used to take us 5,000 people to have. So I think the ability to do things in a more distributed way, to have instantaneous knowledge across broad arrays of geography, that's as true in the industrial space as any place else. And then, again, none of this happens, your question's for Siya, which is without good public policy, right? The only thing I would add, maybe, I think one of the things that has helped me immensely is that I have a local team here in Africa who, I don't have to read the paper. I always watch CNBC, but I don't have to read the paper.
Well, you used to own us, and you've perfected the soundbite.
I don't have to read the paper. So I think too many people look at Africa sitting in London or New York City or Washington, D.C. and say, oh my God, that's too risky. Versus when you see it on the ground, you say, gosh, if we can do these three things, we can de-risk it to this point, and then it's acceptable risk. But you only get a sense for that if you're on the ground. And that's the biggest mistake that people, first they see it as one continent instead of multiple countries, and second, they want to pass judgment on it from London.
Well, we spent a lot of time engaging with Jay Ireland, your president and CEO of GE Africa, on these very topics. Let's now look at the opportunity for some questions from the audience. We have a roving mic. If the protocol could be observed, if you could stand, state your name, where you're from, and ask the relevant question to one of our esteemed panelists here. Do we have any questions? You should be rushing. We're talking about $100 billion industrial internet. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. It's been very informative. Keir Nellens from Cisco, and good GE partner. The one thing I haven't heard is, we talk about the borders and cross-border trade and queues at the borders. Surely the interworking with governments and helping them digitize that aspect is a key factor. How's that going? How's the energy you doing, partnering with them or engaging with them on that change? Because you can get everything to the edge, but if you can't get it over, what's the point?
Yeah, which is why we're talking about the customs union. For instance, the PTA and all of those discussions, different trade ministers through their governments are talking about how to make this interconnectedness, how to remove paper, for instance, which is quite essential. So governments talking to one another, but also within the African Union and creating the entire continent as one free trade area is actually quite critical in terms of how you move goods and services. So those discussions are taking place. There are some that are also just amongst countries in a region, but there's also others that are continental in nature. Some are more advanced than others, some are at embryonic stage. But those discussions are taking place, and our ministers of trade and industry are actually leading that particular charge in terms of assisting us to deal with that particular aspect, which is quite critical in terms of realizing some of these streams.